In every story, there's always some kind of conflict. Whether it's man versus man versus society, man versus nature, or man versus fate, the protagonists are usually always forced against something external. Sometimes it's a monster, sometimes it's the world itself standing in their way, or even just another person with a completely different ideology. But there exists another kind of conflict. One that's not about fighting anything external at all. The kind of conflict where the protagonist becomes their own worst enemy. Instead of some big bad enemy, their insecurities become the hardest battle to fight. It's this kind of conflict in fiction that explores the conflict between man and himself. In most stories, conflict ends when one side wins. But in Man vs. Self, there is no victory, only an understanding. Their accomplishment in these stories aren't how many foes they can defeat, but by how honestly they face themselves. Sometimes the hardest thing to confront isn't some world-conquering threat, but the one in the mirror. But what makes Man vs. Self so powerful is that it mirrors real life. Everyone carries regrets, shame, or impulses they wish they can silence. It's this conflict that transforms those emotions into a story. It externalizes the invisible struggle for identity, purpose, and peace. When a character chooses compassion over cruelty, restraint over rage, or truth over denial, that small decision feels enormous because it represents a victory over the self. This is why Man vs. Self often leads to redemption. Redemption is the natural resolution of this conflict. Not a cleansing of the past, but an acceptance of it. The character doesn't erase their sins, they learn to live with them. They stop running from who they were and instead take responsibility for what they've become. It's not forgiveness from the world that redeems them, but the act of forgiving themselves. Man vs. Self defines some of the most memorable protagonists in all of fiction. Characters such as Darth Vader, Snape, Zuko, Kratos, Arthur Morgan. These characters aren't defined by their enemies they fight, but the internal battles they fight within that makes them so memorable. Their struggles with guilt, anger, pride, identity, and redemption are what make them feel human, and what ultimately makes them unforgettable. What makes Darth Vader such a memorable character isn't his iconic appearance or voice, but the tragedy beneath the mask. Being torn between who he became and who he once was, and his final act of redemption that resolves his internal conflict in a single, powerful choice to reject evil and to save his son. What makes Zuko memorable is his journey that transforms him from an angry, conflicted exile seeking validation into someone who learns to define his own identity through self-reflection, moral choice, and redemption, rather than approval or destiny. But then there are characters who don't fully overcome their conflict, and instead give into the worst parts of themselves and let it control them. These characters find themselves becoming more and more of a villain, and less of the person they wish to be. Characters like Walter White, Tony Soprano, Dutch Vanderlyn, and Travis Bickle all follow this path in different ways, each becoming consumed by their own self-destruction. What makes these characters so tragic is that none of them begin as monsters. They begin as people with understandable motivations and good intentions, or genuine vulnerabilities. But over time, their pride, paranoia, isolation, or desire for control slowly corrupts them, turning their internal conflict into the very thing that destroys them. What makes Tony Soprano tragic is he's defined by a constant internal struggle between self-awareness and self-destruction. He recognizes the emptiness and harm caused by his violent lifestyle, but despite moments of reflection and therapy, he ultimately refuses to truly change, allowing his anger, ego, and need for control to consume him. Walter White is defined by an internal conflict between his desire to provide for his family and his growing obsession with power, pride, and control. Although he begins with understandable intentions, he gradually gives into his ego, allowing the identity of Heisenberg to consume him until he becomes the very thing he once feared. And while characters like Darth Vader or Zuko are remembered for overcoming their flaws, characters like Tony Soprano and Walter White are memorable for the opposite reason. Their selfishness, denial, and inability to change feel painfully human, making their own downfall feel both tragic and realistic. In the end, every character defined by man versus self faces the same enemy, themselves. And like these characters, we also have to face ourselves every day. We all carry internal battles of our own, doubts, regrets, and flaws we try to overcome. But like these characters, we all have the power to change, to confront our darkness, to grow, and to find peace with who we are. And that is what Man vs. Self shows us. It reviews the profound invisible struggle within a person, the fight between who we are and who we are capable of becoming. We are shaped by our choices, whether we allow our past mistakes to define us, or whether we choose to become something better. It's ultimately up to us. We may be influenced by what we've done and what we've been through, but we are not trapped by it. Change is possible, but it requires awareness, effort, and the willingness to confront ourselves honestly. If we have the strength and willpower, we don't have to bend to the past, to our fears, or even to ourselves. We are what we make ourselves to be, and that's where the true victory lies. Thank you.